at common sense, nodded politely, and then did the exact opposite. From a woman who tried anti-aging treatments with snake venom, to a man who decided the best way to recycle a propane tank was with a high-powered rifle, these are the moments when confidence completely overpowered survival instinct. No actors, no exaggerations, just real people making decisions so spectacularly bad that even physics had to step in and say, "All right, that's enough." So consider this video a public service announcement, because every safety warning label you've ever ignored exists because someone on this list tried it first. Let's begin. 1. The venomous facelift. Humanity has spent thousands of years searching for the secret to eternal youth. We've bathed in donkey milk. We've injected botulinum toxin into our faces. We've rubbed creams made from snail slime, fish eggs, and things that probably shouldn't be described as skincare. But Eleanor decided that modern cosmetics were too boring. She wanted something natural, something ancient, something terrifyingly stupid. Eleanor was a wealthy socialite who had recently discovered the concept of mithridatism, the ancient idea that you can build immunity to poison by exposing yourself to small doses over time. Historically, this was done by paranoid kings who were worried about being assassinated. Eleanor was doing it because she read on a very questionable internet forum that snake venom could rejuvenate the skin. According to the post, small doses of venom would stimulate circulation, trigger cellular repair, and cause swelling that naturally filled in wrinkles. In other words, a biological Botox injection with fangs. So Eleanor adopted a pet snake, not a harmless garden snake, not even a mildly venomous one. She chose a Russell's viper, a species famous for two things: a spectacularly bad temper, venom that turns human blood into something resembling strawberry jam. She named it Cuddles, which was the first warning sign. For months, Eleanor developed what can only be described as the most dangerous skincare routine in history. She would gently provoke Cuddles until the snake delivered a small defensive bite on her arm. If the swelling was mild, she considered it a success. Her friends watched this routine with the kind of horrified fascination normally reserved for train wrecks. Eleanor, meanwhile, proudly told everyone she had discovered the ultimate organic anti-aging treatment. The glow she bragged about was actually the early stages of tissue damage. But Eleanor was convinced she had cracked the code. And then came the night of her annual charity gala. She looked in the mirror and decided she looked tired. So she did what any rational person would do before hosting a formal event. She decided to double the dose. Instead of gently irritating Cuddles, she aggressively harassed the snake until it struck. And this time, Cuddles stopped pretending to be a dermatologist. The viper delivered a full defensive bite, injecting a massive load of hemotoxic venom directly into her bloodstream. What happened next was not rejuvenation, it was biological demolition. Her arms swelled instantly, her blood began to clot internally, and her organs started shutting down one by one. By the time paramedics arrived, Eleanor's skincare routine had officially become a medical emergency. She did technically achieve eternal youth, because she stopped aging permanently that night, at the age of 42. Which is a powerful reminder that while beauty might be pain, stupidity is usually fatal. Nếu sếp muốn, tôi sẽ viết tiếp này. 2.
The Ballistic Recycling Program. Câu chuyện bắn bình propane, một trong những gọn hải đen hay nhất. Và tôi sẽ giữ đúng style. Châm biếm kiểu Mỹ, nhịp kể, cinematic punchline, cực ác cuối mỗi story. Kiếp 2. The Ballistic Recycling Program. Out in the deep woods of rural Washington state, self-reliance isn't just a lifestyle. It's practically a religion. People grow their own food, fix their own trucks, build their own sheds, and generally believe that if something breaks, you don't call a professional. You grab a toolbox. Or in Gary's case, a rifle. Gary had a problem sitting in the middle of his backyard. A giant, rusty 500-gallon propane tank that had been there for years, like a metallic zit on the face of nature. It was ugly. It was old. And it was still about half full of propane. Now, a normal person would call a professional hazardous waste service. They would safely empty the tank, haul it away, and charge a reasonable fee.
Gary saw that fee and had a different idea. Because in Gary's mind, paying someone else to solve a problem was basically admitting defeat, and Gary didn't lose to problems. He outsmarted them. So he stared at the tank. Then he stared at the high-powered hunting rifle leaning against the wall of his garage. And somewhere in his brain, a plan formed that would make any physics teacher immediately begin stress-eating chalk. Gary decided the easiest way to deal with the tank was simple. He would shoot it. The bullet would punch a small hole in the steel, the gas would slowly leak out, and the tank would harmlessly depressurize. After that, he could sell the scrap metal. Problem solved. $50 saved. Genius. Now technically, Gary did understand that propane was flammable, so he took what he believed was a safe distance, 30 yards, which, for reference, is an excellent distance for throwing a frisbee, but a catastrophically short distance for engaging in ballistic negotiations with a pressurized explosive container. Gary set up behind a thin plywood shed, which he apparently believed qualified as bomb shelter engineering. He raised his rifle, took careful aim, and fired. The bullet struck the tank with perfect accuracy, right in the center. For about half a second, nothing happened, and then physics entered the chat. The bullet didn't just make a small hole, it compromised the structural integrity of a pressurized steel cylinder containing explosive gas. The tank didn't explode like it does in the movies. No dramatic fireball, no slow-motion shockwave. Instead, the tank violently disintegrated. The pressurized propane burst outward instantly, ripping the metal shell apart like a soda can in a hydraulic press. And the entire tank became a fragmentation grenade the size of a washing machine. Chunks of steel flew in every direction at terrifying speed. One specific piece of shrapnel, the heavy metal collar around the valve, launched backward along the exact path the bullet had taken. Almost like the tank had decided to return the favor. The metal fragment covered the 30 yards in less than a second. Gary didn't even have time to lower the rifle. The steel collar struck him with the force of a truck. The police later described the scene with remarkable understatement. Gary had successfully destroyed the propane tank. It was now scattered across 3 neighboring properties. Unfortunately, so was the rest of his plan. In the end, Gary saved about $50 in disposal fees, but he also demonstrated a very important lesson about home improvement. If your solution to household chores involves a sniper rifle, you are probably doing chores wrong. The honest escapologist. There's a very thin line between bravery and stupidity, and in the world of street magic, that line gets crossed constantly because audiences don't pay to see safe tricks. They pay to see danger, suspense, the thrilling possibility that something might go horribly wrong. Pierre was a street escapologist performing along the banks of the River Seine in Paris. For years, his act had been simple: handcuffs, chains, maybe a locked trunk. The classic magician stuff. But crowds were getting bored. The internet had raised the bar. People had seen everything: fire stunts, death-defying illusions, underwater escapes. Pierre realized if he wanted attention, he needed something bigger, something dramatic, something unforgettable. So he announced his new grand finale, the watery grave. The idea was simple. Pierre would be chained, padlocked, sealed inside a wooden crate, and then dropped into the river. After a tense minute or two, he would burst free from the water to applause and a rain of coins. It was a good plan, except for one fatal detail. Most escape artists cheat. They use trick locks, gimmicked cuffs, and hidden mechanisms designed to open easily once the performer knows the secret. The audience believes it's impossible, but the magician knows it's actually very manageable. Pierre, however, made a terrible mistake. He decided to make the stunt more authentic. Instead of buying trick locks, he went to a high-end hardware store and purchased real industrial security padlocks. Not stage props, not magic equipment, actual hardened steel locks designed to keep professional thieves out of vaults. In Pierre's mind, this would make the act more impressive. In reality, it turned his performance into a very well-advertised suicide attempt. On the day of the show, a crowd gathered along the riverbank. The atmosphere was electric. People pulled out their phones, ready to film the dramatic escape. Pierre stood proudly as assistants chained him up. Heavy chains, real locks, no tricks. He smiled confidently and gave the crowd a thumbs up. The lid of the wooden crate was nailed shut. The box was lifted to the edge of the river, and then, splash! The crate disappeared beneath the dark green water. The crowd began counting. 30 seconds. 1 minute. People cheered. This was the exciting part. 2 minutes passed. The cheering became uncertain. 3 minutes passed. Now people were looking at each other. Inside the crate, Pierre had discovered something deeply unfortunate. The locks worked perfectly. His small metal pick snapped in the first lock he tried to open. Turns out that when you're underwater, in total darkness, holding your breath while panicking, precision lock-picking becomes extremely difficult. The hardened steel mechanisms refused to budge. He wasn't fighting cheap stage props. He was fighting professional-grade engineering. And engineering was winning. On the surface, the water remained completely still. No dramatic escape. No triumphant splash. Eventually, a few people in the audience realized something was wrong. Emergency divers, who had been watching the show themselves, jumped into the river and pulled the crate back up. It took them several minutes and heavy bolt cutters to open the locks. Inside, Pierre was still chained exactly as he had been when the crate went in. He had proven something important that day. The locks were indeed escape-proof. Unfortunately, the demonstration required a permanent volunteer. In the final analysis, Pierre was a mediocre magician, but an excellent customer for the locksmith industry. Story born: The bicycle versus bobsled track. Một trong những đoạn hài đen cộng physics humiliation rất mạnh, đúng style Darwin Awards. Tiếp 4. The bicycle versus the bobsled track. The Winter Olympics exist for one simple reason: to prove that human beings can travel at terrifying speeds on frozen water and somehow survive. But those athletes use specialized equipment, trained teams, and tracks designed for sleds built with aerospace-level engineering. Hans, unfortunately, had none of those things. What he did have was a mountain bike, an alarming amount of confidence, and a complete misunderstanding of basic physics. Hans lived in Germany, not far from the famous Oberhof bobsled track, one of the fastest ice tracks in Europe. It's the kind of place where professional athletes wearing aerodynamic suits and helmets rocket down polished ice at nearly 80 miles per hour. Naturally, the facility is closed to the public, especially at night, especially to people with bicycles. Hans, however, believed that rules were merely suggestions written by people who hated fun. So one evening, around 2 a.m., he climbed the fence, ignored several large warning signs written in very serious German, and dragged his bike to the top of the starting chute. Standing there, staring down the icy tunnel, Hans probably felt like a pioneer, a legend, a man about to create the most viral stunt the internet had ever seen. Unfortunately, Hans had overlooked one small detail. Bobsleds steer using steel runners and centrifugal force. Bicycles steer using friction between rubber tires and the road. And on a sheet of polished Olympic ice, friction is basically a myth. But Hans didn't know that. He climbed onto the bike, pushed off, and began the ride. For the first few seconds, it probably felt incredible. The slope was gentle at the start, and the bike rolled forward smoothly, wind in his hair, adrenaline pumping. For a brief moment, he may have believed this was the greatest idea of his life. Then the track dropped into the first real descent. Gravity, which has never once lost an argument in the history of the universe, immediately took control. Hans accelerated rapidly, 20 miles per hour, 30, 40. At this point, he tried to steer, which is when the bicycle politely informed him that steering was no longer an option. The tires lost traction completely, sliding across the ice like hockey pucks. The bike shot forward uncontrollably, turning Hans from a cyclist into a passenger on a very fast mistake. The first curve approached. Professional bobsleds take these turns by banking high on the walls, using their runners to guide them safely along the curve. Hans hit the curve and attempted to lean. The bike instantly slid out from under him, but momentum carried him forward anyway. What followed was less of a ride and more of a human pinball machine. Hans bounced off the frozen walls of the track at increasing speed, tumbling, sliding, and ricocheting through the chute while gravity continued accelerating him toward the bottom. The track, after all, is designed to guide sleds safely downhill. It is not designed to catch flying cyclists. By the time Hans reached the final section, he had become a full-speed human projectile. At the bottom of the track sits a reinforced concrete barrier. A very solid one, the kind designed to stop runaway sleds. Hans reached it traveling at roughly the speed of a small motorcycle. The collision was instantaneous, violent, and completely unavoidable. Investigators later noted that Hans had been wearing a bicycle helmet, which remained perfectly intact. Unfortunately, helmets are designed to protect against falling off a bike at 15 miles per hour, not colliding with Olympic infrastructure at highway speeds. Hans died instantly, a victim of his own inability to understand one very simple concept. Rubber tires and ice are not friends. They are mortal enemies. And if a sport requires a sled, a helmet, and a national team of engineers, you should probably not show up with a mountain bike and vibes. Nếu xếp muốn, tôi sẽ viết tiếp story 5, The Bug Bomb Apocalypse.
Đây là một trong những đoạn Darwin Awards kinh điển nhất. 20 bug bombs, nổ tung cả nhà. Và punchline cực mạnh. Tiếp 5. The Bug Bomb Apocalypse. There are few things more irritating to a homeowner than a cockroach infestation. It triggers a very primal kind of rage, the kind that makes people forget logic, forget safety, and occasionally forget that blowing up your own house is not an acceptable pest control strategy. Arthur had reached that point. His small suburban home had developed a cockroach problem, and the more he tried to get rid of them, the worse it seemed to get. Every time he turned on the kitchen light, the floor scattered like someone had dropped a handful of living raisins. Arthur decided he wasn't just going to kill the bugs, he was going to declare war. So, he went to the hardware store and bought a product called a bug bomb.
If you've never seen one, it's a small aerosol can that releases pesticide fog into the air, filling a room with chemicals designed to kill every insect inside. The instructions on the label were very clear. Use 1 can per room. Arthur looked at that instruction and thought something very dangerous. That's probably a suggestion. Because Arthur's version of math worked like this: if 1 bug bomb kills bugs, then 20 bug bombs must kill them 20 times better. So Arthur returned home with an entire shopping bag full of foggers and proceeded to place them throughout his modest little house. In the living room, the hallway, the bedroom, the kitchen, 20 industrial-strength bug bombs sat waiting like a tiny army of chemical warfare devices. Arthur activated them all at once. Suddenly the house filled with thick white pesticide fog. The cans hissed as they released their contents into the air, slowly transforming the entire building into something resembling a toxic gas chamber for insects. Satisfied with his work, Arthur stepped outside onto the front porch to let the chemicals do their job. For a few minutes, everything was going according to plan, and then Arthur realized something unfortunate. His car keys were still inside the house. Now, a rational person would simply wait an hour for the fog to clear, or call a locksmith, or accept the minor inconvenience of walking somewhere. But Arthur had already committed to the evening's theme of terrible decisions. He decided he would just run inside quickly and grab the keys. He opened the front door and was immediately swallowed by a cloud of thick white fog so dense he could barely see a few feet ahead. What Arthur didn't realize was that bug bombs don't just release pesticide. They also release flammable propellant gases, often propane or butane. By activating 20 of them inside a small house, Arthur had unknowingly filled every room with an extremely combustible fuel-air mixture. In other words, he had accidentally turned his home into a giant bomb. Arthur stumbled through the foggy living room, holding his breath, waving his hands in front of him while trying to find the kitchen counter. His lungs were burning. His eyes were watering. He couldn't see anything. Then his hand brushed against the wall. An instinct kicked in. Without thinking, he flipped the light switch. Click. That tiny switch produced a microscopic electrical spark. A spark so small that under normal circumstances it would be completely harmless. But inside a house full of aerosol propellant, it was the equivalent of lighting a match inside a gas station. The ignition was instantaneous. The entire house detonated in a massive fuel-air explosion. Windows shattered. The roof lifted completely off the walls. The blast wave ripped through the structure like a bomb going off in the center of the living room. Neighbors several blocks away reported hearing the explosion. When firefighters arrived, they discovered that the cockroach infestation had indeed been eliminated. In fact, every living insect within 100 feet was gone. Arthur had successfully solved his pest problem. Unfortunately, he had also solved the problem of his house still existing. Investigators later concluded that Arthur had effectively created a homemade thermobaric explosion using nothing more than household pest control products and extremely poor judgment. So technically speaking, the bug bombs worked. Arthur just forgot one small detail. When your pest control plan requires more explosives than a demolition crew, you may have slightly misunderstood the assignment. 2.6. The Cat Rescue Catapult. There is a classic image that appears in cartoons, children's books, and small-town folklore: a cat stuck in a tree. Usually, the story ends the same way. Someone grabs a ladder. Maybe the fire department shows up. The cat is safely rescued. Everyone claps, and life continues normally. Kevin decided to try a slightly different approach. Kevin's cat, a very unimpressed orange tabby named Mr. Whiskers, had climbed about 20 feet up a large oak tree in Kevin's front yard and refused to come down. This was not unusual behavior for cats. What was unusual was Kevin's plan to solve the problem. Kevin briefly considered calling animal control, but that would involve admitting he needed help. And Kevin was the type of man who believed every problem could be solved with creativity, determination, and extremely questionable engineering. He studied the situation for a while. The cat was sitting on a long, flexible branch. The branch extended out from the trunk like a giant wooden fishing rod. And eventually, Kevin came up with a plan so confident, so ambitious, and so catastrophically wrong that it deserves a place in the Engineering Hall of Shame. Kevin decided he would bend the branch down. His idea was simple: tie a rope to the branch, tie the other end of the rope to his car, then drive forward slowly, pulling the branch down to ground level so he could simply grab the cat. To Kevin, this seemed like an elegant mechanical solution. To anyone with even a basic understanding of physics, it looked like the setup for a giant wooden slingshot. But Kevin proceeded anyway. He tied a thick rope around the branch and attached the other end to the rear bumper of his sedan. Then he climbed into the driver's seat and began slowly pulling forward. At first, it worked. The rope tightened. The branch began to bend downward. Mr. Whiskers watched this development with the quiet skepticism only cats possess. Kevin looked into his rearview mirror and saw the branch lowering, but not quite enough. So he pressed the accelerator a little harder. The oak branch bent farther. Now it was under enormous tension, storing massive amounts of potential energy like a giant bowstring pulled back by an invisible archer. Kevin leaned out the window and saw that the branch was almost within reach, but not quite. So he did what many people do when they are one bad decision away from disaster. He gave it a little more gas. The rope went tight as steel. The branch bent even farther. The wood groaned under the strain. And then the tree decided it had had enough. The branch didn't slowly crack. It snapped. Loudly. Violently. Freed from the tension, the massive broken branch didn't fall gently to the ground. It whipped backward with incredible speed, launching toward the source of the force that had bent it. Kevin had just enough time to realize something had gone terribly wrong. The branch shot through the air like a wooden missile and smashed directly through the rear window of his car. The jagged end of the broken limb punched through the seat and into Kevin before he could even move. The car rolled forward a few feet and came to a stop. The engine continued idling quietly. The rescue mission was over. Meanwhile, the sudden crack of the branch startled Mr. Whiskers. The cat simply let go of the tree, dropped 20 feet, landed perfectly on all 4 feet, and calmly walked back toward the house like nothing had happened. Kevin had died trying to rescue an animal that was fully capable of rescuing itself, which perfectly demonstrates one of nature's most consistent rules. In the eternal contest between human ingenuity and feline indifference, the cat always wins. Dibbai, the piano. Moving shortcut. Moving houses is one of the most stressful experiences a person can endure. It ranks somewhere between tax audits, root canals, and trying to assemble IKEA furniture without losing your sanity. But Bob believed he had a solution to make the process easier. Unfortunately, that solution involved ignoring gravity. Bob owned a beautiful antique upright piano. It was heavy, extremely heavy. An upright piano can weigh anywhere between 400 and 600 pounds, which means moving one requires planning, specialized equipment, and ideally several people who know what they're doing. Bob had none of those things. What he did have was confidence. Bob lived on the second floor of a small apartment building with a narrow staircase. After struggling for several minutes to angle the piano toward the stairs, Bob realized something important. The piano was not going to fit. Most people at this point would hire professional movers or rent a crane. Bob, however, believed professionals were just people who charged money for things he could easily do himself. So Bob invented a plan. Instead of carrying the piano up the stairs, he would lift it to the balcony. His method involved a rope, a pulley, and the unwavering belief that physics was optional. He attached a rope around the piano and ran it through a small pulley mounted on the balcony railing. Several friends stood upstairs pulling the rope while Bob remained on the ground to guide the piano as it rose through the air. And to be fair, for a few seconds the plan actually worked. The piano slowly lifted off the ground. It swayed slightly in the breeze like a giant wooden pendulum. Bob stood underneath it with his hands raised, gently pushing it to keep it from hitting the wall. This is the moment when several very important safety rules were being broken simultaneously. Rule number 1, never stand under a suspended load. Rule number 2, never trust a rope that looks like it might have survived the Civil War. Rule number 3, gravity is undefeated. As the piano rose higher, the rope began to strain under the enormous weight. The fibers stretched. The pulley creaked. Bob's friends continued pulling. And then, the rope snapped. There was no slow warning, no dramatic countdown, just a sharp crack. The rope whipped upward, and the piano immediately obeyed the laws of physics. It fell. Bob had about half a second to realize the mistake he had made. Unfortunately, half a second is not enough time to escape a falling 500-pound musical instrument. The piano landed directly on top of him with catastrophic force. When emergency responders arrived, the situation was grimly ironic. The piano itself was barely damaged. After all, it had been designed to survive decades of enthusiastic musicians. Bob, however, had not been designed to survive being crushed by a falling orchestra. The police report later included a small, darkly humorous detail. The piano was tuned to the key of B-flat, which, according to one responder, was also the exact shape Bob had become. In the end, Bob proved something very important. While music may soothe the soul, a falling piano will absolutely flatten the person standing underneath it. And if your moving strategy begins with the words, "I think I can rig something up," it may be time to call professionals.
Tip 8. The Winery Oxygen Problem.
Tuscany is famous for many things: rolling hills, beautiful vineyards, and some of the best wine on earth. It is also, occasionally, the site of extremely preventable accidents involving people who think free wine is worth almost anything. Lorenzo was one of those people. Lorenzo loved good wine, but unfortunately, his wallet was more accustomed to the discount shelf section of the grocery store. So one evening, he came up with a plan to upgrade his lifestyle. Instead of buying expensive wine, he would steal it. Late one night, Lorenzo slipped into a high-end vineyard property and made his way toward the cellar. Inside, he found exactly what he had hoped for: rows of expensive bottles, barrels of aging wine, and several enormous stainless steel fermentation tanks, each containing thousands of liters of freshly fermenting grapes. At first, Lorenzo planned to grab a few bottles and leave, but standing there, surrounded by all that wine, a new thought crossed his mind. Why steal the bottled stuff when he could sample it straight from the source? The tanks were enormous, some over 10 feet tall, with metal ladders leading to a hatch on top. Lorenzo climbed one of the ladders and opened the hatch. Inside was a massive vat of dark red fermenting wine. It smelled incredible, but what Lorenzo didn't know was that fermentation produces something else besides alcohol: carbon dioxide, lots of it. And carbon dioxide has an important property. It's heavier than oxygen. That means it sinks and collects in low or enclosed spaces, like the inside of fermentation tanks. In fact, wineries have strict safety rules because entering one of these tanks without proper ventilation can be instantly fatal. Lorenzo, however, was not familiar with industrial winery safety procedures. He leaned far over the edge of the tank, trying to scoop some wine with a cup. And then, he took a deep breath. Unfortunately, the air inside the tank wasn't air at all. It was almost pure carbon dioxide. Within seconds, his brain was starved of oxygen. There was no dramatic struggle, no warning. The human brain shuts down very quickly when deprived of oxygen. Lorenzo simply lost consciousness. His body slumped forward, and he fell headfirst into the vat of wine. The next morning, the winemaker arrived to check the fermentation tanks and discovered something extremely unusual floating in one of them. Lorenzo had died instantly after inhaling the CO2. He never had a chance to escape. The entire batch of wine had to be discarded, costing the vineyard thousands of dollars. So in the end, Lorenzo succeeded in two things. He ruined an expensive vintage, and he became the only person in history to literally die inside a barrel of wine. Which is a powerful reminder that if you want a drink, it is usually safer to go to a bar, because the farm-to-table experience sometimes comes with unexpected body counts. Dipchin, the lava lamp speedrun. Some inventions are designed to be calming, relaxing, almost meditative. The lava lamp is one of those inventions. It was created in the 1960s as a slow-moving piece of decorative art, a glass lamp filled with wax and liquid that gently rises and falls as it warms up. The key word here is slowly. A lava lamp typically takes 45 minutes to an hour to start working properly. Most people accept this as part of the experience. Steve did not. Steve loved his vintage lava lamp. It sat proudly in his living room like a glowing monument to 1970s aesthetics. But every time he turned it on, he found himself staring impatiently at the cold lump of wax sitting uselessly at the bottom. Waiting an hour for it to start flowing felt unreasonable. In Steve's mind, the problem was obvious. The bulb inside the lamp was only 40 watts. Too weak. Too slow. Steve decided he could improve the design. So he unplugged the lamp, carried the glass vessel into the kitchen, and placed it directly on top of an electric stove burner. He turned the dial to high. Now, most people know that sealed glass containers and stove burners do not mix well. In fact, lava lamp manuals explicitly warn against heating them externally. But Steve treated warning labels the same way most people treat software terms and conditions. He ignored them completely. Standing in front of the stove, arms crossed, Steve waited for his genius life hack to work. And for a moment, it seemed like it might. The wax inside the lamp melted quickly. The liquid began heating up. But something else was happening inside the sealed glass chamber. Pressure was building. Because as the liquid heated, it expanded. The gases inside the lamp expanded. And since the glass container was completely sealed, the pressure had nowhere to go. Steve had unknowingly turned his decorative lava lamp into a small glass pressure bomb. For several seconds, the pressure continued rising. The glass container strained. The liquid inside began to boil. And then the lamp reached its breaking point. There was no warning crack, no slow leak, just a sudden violent explosion. The glass shattered outward with incredible force, sending shards of thick glass, boiling liquid, and molten wax flying across the kitchen like shrapnel from a grenade. Steve was standing directly in front of the stove when it happened. A large fragment of the glass casing shot forward and struck him in the chest with devastating precision. The impact was fatal almost instantly. When investigators arrived later, they found the kitchen covered in purple wax and shattered glass. The lava lamp had finally achieved the flowing motion Steve wanted. Unfortunately, it had done so in the most explosive way possible. In the end, Steve died because he couldn't wait 45 minutes, which is a remarkable way to lose an argument with a decorative lamp. It also proves an important point. If a relaxation device requires patience to function, trying to speed it up with a stove burner usually ends with the party being over permanently. Tip 10. The Decorative Pineapple Heist. Some people collect souvenirs, postcards, magnets, maybe a small statue from a gift shop. Sheila preferred something a little more ambitious. One evening, while walking past a historic English estate, Sheila noticed what she believed would be the perfect addition to her garden. At the top of a brick gate pillar sat a large, decorative stone pineapple. Now, if you're wondering why anyone would put a pineapple on top of a gate, it's actually an old architectural symbol of hospitality that dates back centuries. But this wasn't a small garden ornament. This was an 18th century carved limestone sculpture. Solid stone, extremely heavy, installed permanently on top of the pillar decades ago. To Sheila, however, it looked like something she simply needed to take home. Because in her mind, this wasn't theft, this was interior design opportunity. Late that night, Sheila climbed onto the gate, using the iron bars as footholds until she reached the top of the brick pillar. Standing there in the dark, she began wrestling with the massive stone pineapple. At first, it wouldn't move. The sculpture had been mortared into place years earlier, and although the mortar had weakened over time, it still held firm. But Sheila was determined. She pulled, she twisted, she rocked the pineapple back and forth, and eventually, the old mortar began to crumble. Now here's the critical mistake in Sheila's plan. She was standing directly beneath the object she was trying to remove, looking up at it, pulling it toward her face. The physics of the situation were very simple. If the pineapple came loose, it would fall. And gravity is famously very good at deciding which direction things fall. But Sheila didn't think about that. She assumed that when the pineapple broke free, she would simply catch it in her arms, like catching a ball. Unfortunately, the pineapple weighed about as much as a refrigerator, and gravity had already made its decision. With one final shove, the weakened mortar finally gave way. The pineapple detached instantly and dropped straight down. There was no time to react, no time to step aside. The massive block of limestone fell directly onto Sheila, crushing her against the base of the pillar in a fraction of a second. The next morning, when the estate groundskeeper arrived, he discovered a scene that could only be described as grimly ironic. Sheila had succeeded in stealing the pineapple, but only in the sense that it was now resting directly on top of her. The sculpture itself was almost completely undamaged, which makes sense. After all, it had survived over 200 years of English weather. It had no trouble surviving one amateur art thief. In the end, Sheila died trying to steal a piece of garden decoration, which proves a timeless rule of physics. When you attempt to catch a 300-pound stone object with your face, gravity will always win. If there's one lesson from tonight's stories, it's this. None of these people thought they were doing something stupid. They believed they were being clever, creative, resourceful. But the universe runs on a very simple system. Confidence writes the plan, physics writes the ending, and physics has never once accepted an appeal. Ending/comment bait. Now I want to hear from you. Which one of these decisions was the most unbelievably stupid? The snake skincare routine? The propane tank sniper experiment? Or the lava lamp speedrun? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoyed watching other people make terrible decisions so you don't have to, hit like, subscribe, and remember, every warning label you ignore today exists because someone else already tested it.